Welcome back to Chapter 4. In this video, we're going to brush up on what acquisition is, because that will lead us to extinction and different ways of ending an association built by classical conditioning. So, remember the term acquisition. We defined this back in Chapter 3, but acquisition is the time it takes to make the association between stimuli. Okay, so the strength of an acquisition would be what we call the asymptote of conditioning. So that's the absolute maximum amount of conditioning that can take place in a particular situation. So once you reach your asymptote of conditioning, acquisition is done. Okay, so however long it takes for you to get to the asymptote of conditioning would be your acquisition. It's the amount of time to build your conditioning. Okay, so this is just a great graph showing that in this example, then it takes about 14-15 days of acquisition. Now, obviously, acquisition can change depending on different factors. How closely related your stimuli are, how strong they are, things like that. But what if we want to end an association? So after acquisition, we have our association, we did the conditioning, the learning phase, which is that acquisition, and then we did the testing phase, and everything works. But now we want it to stop. So what do we do? Well, what we're going to do is something called extinction. So extinction is when we omit the US in classical conditioning, and after repeated exposures of the CS and CR without the US, then the relationship between the CR and the CS will decrease. So, because the unconditioned stimulus is not there, then the conditioned responding will weaken and decline. Now, is this like forgetting? No. Forgetting's not the same thing. You're not forgetting what you learned. This is about unlearning something. Okay, so with forgetting, then your behavior changes because of a passage of time, not because of experience. Okay, so here we're actively unlearning it due to the experience of not reinforcing our conditioning with the US. Okay, so here's a graph. And it's really just showing us what happened. So on the x-axis, we have time. On the y-axis, we have the strength of our CR, our conditioned response. So during acquisition, and remember, acquisition's learning, so your conditioned stimulus and unconditioned stimulus will both be present. So during acquisition, the strength of our conditioned response increases because the relationship between the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus strengthens. Okay? Now, once acquisition has occurred, if you want to keep the strength of your CR there, you're going to have to sometimes include the unconditioned response. But if we now only present the conditioned stimulus, then at first we're still going to get a pretty strong conditioned response. But over time, that response is going to weaken until eventually it's going to be gone. Okay, so at this point down here, then your conditioned stimulus is really more like a neutral stimulus again. It doesn't do anything. Okay, so that's extinction. We'll cover this part later. So, what are the effects of an extinction procedure? So the target response of an extinction procedure is to decrease that response when it no longer results in reinforcement. So you want to increase the response variability at first, okay? So that means by increasing the response variability at first, that means at first, sometimes we'll get a response, sometimes we won't, but then over time, we'll just get no response, okay? Now, we're gonna look at a study called Nuringer et al. In 2001, and what they did was they measured the response variability during an extinction trial. So, let's look, oh, there we go. Let's look at that. So they used rats, and they had 2 levers and a key in an operant chamber. Now, you don't know, we might not know what an operant chamber is yet, and that's fine. That's when we're going to talk about operant conditioning. But I just think this is a great example of extinction, so we're going to look at it here. So you can ignore some of this information for now, but it'll make more sense later. But just know there were 2 levers and a key, and the rats had to make 3 responses in order to receive food, and they had an acquisition phase. Okay, so group 1 had to, press both levers and the key. Group 2 could do whatever they wanted. They just had to press 3 random things. All good. And then they started extinction. So during extinction, they would press the levers, but no food would come. Okay? So in this case, so they used it as an operant conditioning, but we can also talk about it in classical conditioning. So in this case, pressing a lever would be your neutral stimulus. Getting food would be a unconditioned stimulus, so food's good. And then their behavior at the end would be they're happy. Okay? So their unconditioned response is being happy, being satisfied with the food. So they're associating pressing a lever with food, which would then make them happy. Okay? So in the extinction phase, then they're still pressing the lever, which is our conditioned stimulus, but they're no longer getting our unconditioned stimulus, which is food. So will they still have their conditioned response, which is like being happy or something, right? So let's look at what happened. So here, in the ones in blue, is where they were reinforced, or they got food. So where it says reinforcement, think of that as the unconditioned stimulus is there. Okay, so you can see when they press the lever and get food, then they press the lever a lot because they're getting happy. Now, when the food's no longer there, they're still pressing the lever, but they're not getting food anymore. So that behavior decreases. So they're not as happy. So they're not going to press the lever as much because they're losing that association with pressing the lever and being happy. So that's extinction. You can see that behavior is decreasing. Now I know this is a little bit different because it's operant conditioning, but you should still be able to understand the basic concepts, right? So you can see that high responding when they're happy, when the conditions or unconditioned stimulus is there. When you remove that unconditioned stimulus, that behavior decreases. So that's exactly like what we see here. Look at that curve. Does that not look very similar to this curve here or this one? Both of these are extinction curves. Okay, so this is just an example that I wanted to show you guys. So here, this is really, again, just looking at when they get the CS, the probability of them responding is pretty high. In extinction, then the probability is pretty low. Okay, so what are the effects of that extinction procedure? So remember that the target response decreases when it's no longer reinforced. We get an increase in response variability at first, and extinction can lead to frustration. So there's an aversive emotional reaction that results from the unexpected absence of a reinforcement. So the rats in that example, when they're pressing the lever, they might get very frustrated because usually when they press it, they get food and then they're happy. But now they press it and nothing happens, so we get a new behavioral response of now they're aggressive or they're frustrated. Okay? So we get a decrease of the satiated response, and now we get an increase in frustration. And so sometimes how we can see this is this frustration will occur, and you can actually see it's kind of like, think of a vending machine. Every time you go, you put in a quarter, you press what you want, it comes out. You put in a quarter, press what you want, it comes out. And now one time you go, you put in a quarter, nothing comes out. You get frustrated. What are you going to do? You're going to start pounding on it. You're going to hit it. You're going to try pressing the buttons again. You're going to press every single button on that vending machine because you are frustrated because your unconditioned stimulus of getting that food is no longer there. Okay, so these are some effects that we see in the extinction procedure. Now, you're probably asking, but why would we even want to end an association? Well, remember that there's some negative associations that we can make with classical conditioning. We could develop fears and phobia. So with extinction, we could get rid of these fears and phobia. Or we could change our food preferences, right? If I eat noodles a lot and just keep eating noodles and keep eating noodles, then without that unconditioned stimulus of my sister telling me that they're worms, I could lose that relationship, and therefore I would no longer have a negative preference for noodles. Okay? So that's why we might want to end these associations. Now, sometimes when we end an association, then a behavior will randomly come back, and that's called spontaneous recovery. So this is if our conditioned stimulus is presented again following a delay after extinction, and the conditioned stimulus somehow produces a conditioned response again. Now, this conditioned response is usually weaker, but it does occur. So what does that look like? Here's our handy-dandy graph again. And so we've got our acquisition, where we've got our conditioned stimulus and unconditioned stimulus, which produces a strong conditioned response. Now, when we remove the unconditioned stimulus and we only present the conditioned stimulus, then that conditioned response slowly decreases until it's gone. Now, if we wait a few days and then we present the conditioned stimulus again, then sometimes, not always, but sometimes, we'll get a conditioned response again. So even after a few days of extinction occurred, we get a spontaneous recovery of that conditioned response. Now, extinction will occur again, you can see here, if we continue to only present the conditioned stimulus. Okay, so that's what's called spontaneous recovery. So extinction occurs, and then after a while, when you present the conditioned stimulus, you get a conditioned response again. Now here's another example, just looking at it. So this is this is a graph from a actual study that was conducted by Sylvia et al. And so here we're measuring the number of trials that occur and the strength of that conditioned response. Okay, so we've got our acquisition in red, extinction in blue, and then we've got these black bars, and this is a 24-hour rest. So after extinction occurred, then there was 24 hours that the rats didn't do anything. They didn't get presented with the CS, they did not get presented with the US, just none of the stimuli were presented. But the next day, they're presented with just the CS again. And we can see we have a response. There is a conditioned response. Now, it's about 50% the magnitude or intensity of the original acquisition, but it is still there. So then extinction occurs again, and they wait another 24 hours. And then they look at, well, can we get a second spontaneous recovery? And it turns out you can. So you can have multiple spontaneous recoveries, but each spontaneous recovery is going to be weaker than the one before it. And that's what we see in purple here. So let's just talk about some examples of the spontaneous recovery in classical conditioning that's been done. So in a study called by Rescarol in 1997, then the goal was tracking in rats. So they wanted the rats to poke their nose into a feeder, and full conditioning by all the groups was then followed by full extinction. Very normal. So in this case, then there was an unconditioned stimulus that was signaled by the conditioned stimulus that was either a noise or a light. And all rats were fully conditioned for this. So they expected, when they heard a noise, they expected the US, and then they would have our conditioned response, right? So the rats were divided into a few groups. So first there was a control group. So this is a pre-CS group. So they had no training, okay? So they didn't really go through conditioning. But then we had a CS rest group and a CS no rest group. So in the CS rest group, then they underwent full conditioning and full extinction, and then they rested for 8 days. In the CS no rest group, then they did full conditioning, full extinction, and then immediately went into testing. So what they're looking at is this magnitude of spontaneous recovery, or does spontaneous recovery even occur in the CS rest rats or the CS no rest rats. So whether or not these rats will see spontaneous recovery after extinction, after 8 days, or even immediately after. Okay. So what did they find? Well, what they found was that rats that were tested right after extinction, so those would be that, what did they call them? CS no rest. That's these rats down here. They did not respond. So we don't see any spontaneous recovery in these rats. Okay, so these are the little circles here. Now, the rats that were tested 8 days after extinction training, though, did experience spontaneous recovery. So what they're showing is that spontaneous recovery only occurs when there is a period of time where the CS is not presented. So there has to be some time between the end of extinction and the beginning of spontaneous recovery. Spontaneous recovery does not occur immediately. So really what we're seeing down here is that these little circles, you can see they stay pretty small. And what's happening is it's really just an extension of that extinction criteria, or that extinction procedure. That's really all it's doing. And you can actually see that the pre-CS, so those rats that never underwent conditioning, they have the exact same response in the first 3 trials as those rats that did CS no rest. So, spontaneous recovery, there needs to be time between the end of extinction and the next presentation of the CS. Okay, now the last kind of ending of the association we're going to talk about is disinhibition. So disinhibition is very similar to dishabituation. They're basically the same thing, except they're ending the association of a different type of learning. So disinhibition is the sudden recovery of a conditioned response during an extinction procedure when a new stimulus is introduced. Okay? So, for instance, if your conditioned stimulus was like a light, maybe it was a red light. A red light indicates food, and so the dog's going to salivate. So during an extinction, the extinction procedure, so extinction still occurring, then putting on a red light is not going to cause that response. However, if you then suddenly put in a green light that the dog maybe hasn't seen before, that might actually recover that conditioned response. So it's something new that kind of confuses the system into responding again. So the difference between disinhibition and spontaneous recovery is that with spontaneous recovery, you're using the same CS. With disinhibition, it's a new stimulus. Okay? Also, don't confuse disinhibition with dishabituation. Dishabituation is the reappearance of a habituated response, whereas disinhibition is the recovery of a conditioned response. Okay, so you have to, when you're deciding is it disinhibition or dishabituation, you have to think about what type of learning occurred. Was it habituation learning or was it classical conditioned learning? And so knowing what type of learning occurred, you can then decide which type of association ending term you're going to use. Otherwise, they're basically the same thing.